Hi there. My name is Lisa Chiu. I'm a digital producer at CGTN America, and I am here on this Saturday talking to our correspondent Toby Muse, who is at his house in the DC area. But he just came back from a really interesting reporting trip to the Cheyenne River reservation in South Dakota. And tell me, Toby, what were some of the you were there to talk about how they responded to COVID-19. And so what were some of the findings that you saw there?
That's correct. So there was a bunch of reasons that ended up getting me down there. I was interested in this. I think I read in a newspaper that said, if you took Native American reservations and classified them as states, at one point during the COVID crisis, the 5 worst states in the United States, worst affected, would be these 5 Native American reservations. You had this, it was like wildfire spreading at one point through these Native American reservations. We found, by the time I was there, I found this statistic that said a Native American was more than twice as likely to have died from coronavirus as, say, a white American. And so it looked like this community had been hit very hard. But what was interesting, even as I was doing pre-production, was that they had come up with their own tools to fight back against the coronavirus. And I think in news, that's always very interesting. I think when you start out as a journalist, you can be tempted to just do a story that says, here's a problem. What becomes more interesting as you progress as a journalist is to say, here's a problem, here's an innovative, original way that people are finding to combat that problem. So that was a story I saw in there. And as you said, it was the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, which is there in South Dakota. So I ended up speaking to someone within the tribal council, and through him, we were able to facilitate all of these different stories. The main stories I ended up doing were, one, a kind of general overview of how the tribal community, Native American community, had suffered the coronavirus, but also found solutions. We can talk about that later if you want. The second was about the importance of languages. Because I have worked with other indigenous communities across Latin America, they're very different, but they share something that they do share something important, which is it's an oral tradition. This means that the knowledge, the history, the language is passed down from person to person. It's not written down. It's starting to be written down. But what that means is we know that COVID-19 attacks the elderly. In sort of, let's just call it, I'm going to talk in generalities now, but in sort of mainstream American society, cut me off if I'm talking too much.
No, this is great.
In mainstream American society, when we were used to these stories about, well, people saying goodbye, these heartbreaking stories to their grandparents. You know, we all know the story about people saying goodbye over an iPad or something. But if you take an older person in sort of mainstream American society, well, their central place in society is kind of, they've taken one step to a side, that they're retired, they've taken a backseat position. That's not the case in an orally translated culture. In fact, the elders are tremendously important because they retain knowledge, they retain culture, they retain the language. So I did this story about the languages, about the devastating impact COVID had on these Native American languages. And one of them, I spoke to this man, Manny Ironhawk, this great guy who's an old guy who speaks the language. He may be one of less than 1,000 people who speak Lakota, this Native American language.
Wow.
Once those people are gone, that's it. I mean, there's not like another community that lives in Brazil. There's not another community that, that's it. These people in South Dakota, North Dakota, these are the last speakers of this language. The final story was I wanted to see how they've been implementing this vaccine program. And it was just a really fun story because this is the 4th largest Native American reservation in the United States, 3 million acres. So these people are driving all across this reservation in order to deliver the vaccines. And at the time, they were actually far outpaced the United States average. I think the United States average is starting to catch up to them. But by the time I was there, they had vaccinated something like 1/3 of their entire community.
How were they able to do that given how much more devastated they were affected by COVID?
this was the fascinating thing they did. Instead of waiting for people to come to them, they went to people. So they would drive on these, they would pack up a few vaccines, they would drive out. So we went with them. It was like a 3-hour drive to this tiny town called Whitehorse. And they did vaccinate 3 people. But what was interesting was to then see the problem that they're facing now is that it's basically kind of plateaued. They said that they did really fast, good vaccinations at the beginning. Now they're running into resistance. They figure about 2/3 of people are quite resistant, are quite reluctant to get the vaccine. We spoke to one man who was getting it himself, an old man. He said that his brother and his son were scared of the vaccine. I said, what are they scared of?
What scares them? Is it part of the history of colonization?
I think that's it. I think that's part of it, exactly. I think there's this idea of when you look at pandemics that have spread through the Native American population that have been brought by outsiders, sometimes they suspect on purpose in the history of the United States over the past 300-400 years. And so you get like the government arriving with this injection. And yeah, I think some people are scared of that.
Right. Talk about what it was like to just be on the reservation as a non-Native person. How were you received? What was it like to get there and to travel within the reservation?
Well, as I say, these are vast reservations. So every car journey was like 3 or 4 hours. And it was just these endlessly, you're traveling through the Great Plains. So there's just nothing there. I mean, it's just these, and you can't see anything. You stand on a kind of hill and there's not even big hills, but just kind of a mound of earth. There's no mountains. And you look 360, you cannot see a building in certain cases. We would travel through this, we would see herds of buffalo, antelope, eagles, pheasants. Just the wildlife there is incredible. So that was traveling through it, just very beautiful, a very kind of awe-inspiring landscape. You know, you can't be indifferent to that landscape. It's just so massive. How were we received? That's a really good question. As a journalist, we were received just wonderfully. Everybody was very helpful. Everybody kind of wanted to help out. Everybody welcomed, opened their doors. But you could also tell, because I had done this pre-production, you could also tell as a journalist, we've had this feeling, if I hadn't have done that pre-production, no one would have spoken to me. I just know that feeling that you turn up to a certain part and people are like, have you, no, I'm not talking to you. So, yeah, they were excellent. They were really, really great.
Yeah, I traveled a few times to the Navajo reservation when I was a reporter in Arizona, and very similar experience. I remember driving, and it's like the largest reservation by land size, and I just remember getting out of my car and like I had never heard silence like that before.
So the one thing why we couldn't have that silence is because in the Great Plains, you've got these whipping winds. So that never is an option. These winds would just shake our car sometimes. But it must be beautiful. I had thought about perhaps going to the Navajo reservations as well. In the reservation I went to, again, the Cheyenne River, they had talked about how bad it had hit their cousins in the Navajo reservation. That was another set that had just been absolutely devastated by COVID-19.
Right. Let's see. So one of the stories that really struck me was your story you were following one of the women that was going to these remote locations to give vaccines. And then it turned out her mother had actually passed away of COVID-19. I mean, how was it for her to have to do that work and then not being able to say goodbye to her mother? And it just makes me think about the mental health response to COVID-19.
Yeah, that was heartbreaking. And just to see how much she was working with her community, these long days they have of just these endless drives, and then to hear that devastating story that, yes, her mother had died, it was really sad. And they really do describe this kind of exhaustion of just the bad days. The nadir for that reservation was November. That was when it really hit hard. And there's a number of reasons why the reservation was so prone to this, I think, which is an important, one of the things in my story as well is this idea that what the Native Americans do not want is they don't want a return to life before the pandemic, because that in its own way was not working for them. So you have these reservations where high levels of poverty. In half of the reservation I was in, there's 2 counties. One is, I think it's pronounced Zebak. that I think is the fourth poorest county in the United States. So you had people who automatically have to travel for supplies, but also jobs. They're going on and off the reservation. So every time you're traveling, well, you're potentially opening yourself up for an infection. Every time you're meeting with other people, you're traveling now, you can bring it back. A lot of underlying health conditions that are associated with kind of poverty, poor diets, lack of being able just to keep on top of health issues because of lack of money. So you don't have access to great healthcare. And so COVID arrives with that scenario, and it just goes through them. That was a lot of the frustration of these doctors, that they really were trying their best, but they were sometimes felt like they were fighting these insurmountable problems. And now, because the reservation took these measures by themselves, one of the most important one was setting up checkpoints. That was hugely important for them. And that they were actually fought by the governor of South Dakota. The governor of South Dakota was an ally of then President Donald Trump, and is one of those states that really took no measures whatsoever, proudly. She would give interviews and saying, we're not doing that here. What's for New York works for New York. We're going to do it differently here in South Dakota. Well, the Native American reservation said, well, in our land, we want to set up checkpoints on the outskirts. If someone comes, they have symptoms, we want that, we're going to turn them back. But even if they come in, we can do contact tracing. So if there is a blow up 3 days later, we have a list of these people who came into our reservation. It works. They say that she would try to get these checkpoints down. She would phone President Trump in order to then go via the Indian Affairs Bureau in order to try to take things away from the reservation, at one point threatening to remove the tribal police, for instance. This is all from their side. Wow. That's what they say. But interestingly, the tribal chairman, Harold Frazier, said in an interview, and he's really the biggest figure in this reservation, the most powerful figure, he said that he was working closely with South Dakota. Obviously, two authorities are going to work closely for about a month of the first pandemic. He said after a month, all communication ceased, and he doesn't know if they'll ever talk again. That gives you an idea of how bitter that argument was between these two sides. As the Native American said, we need this to protect ourselves, and the governor of South Dakota said, no, you can't have it.
So even though they have legal tribal sovereignty, the governor was still trying to, according to them, infiltrate into how they could protect their borders?
Absolutely. And this is confirmed as well, because she openly was having this fight. Both sides were open. What I haven't been able to confirm from her side is their stories about her contacting Donald Trump in order to try to know, but she was very open about this is an impediment to transport. We're going to sue to take these checkpoints down. And we tried to film the checkpoint, and we wanted to do a whole sequence of me driving up to the checkpoint. We wanted just to have a few questions with those people manning the checkpoint. And they just said, no, this for us is like a really hot topic. We don't want people who are doing these checkpoints being filmed close up. It's just been an endless headache for us. Right. And they asked us, and they said, just please don't. And, we were, right. It wasn't something, we film what we think is necessary to film. We don't take orders from anybody about what they can, but it didn't seem like a huge thing for us. We just said, sure, that's no problem. It wasn't, we were able to film at a distance, so we got the shot. But it was curious, that thing that they just said, look, just don't film this, please.
Wow. Just going back to that languages story that you worked on. So you said there's like 1,000 speakers right now. Do you have any idea what kind of impact after COVID it has? I mean, how has the number of language speakers diminished because of COVID?
Well, I don't have numbers, but everybody says that it's been devastating because it hit the elderly, and the elderly, if anyone, are going to be the ones who speak the languages. Now, this language is I think it's a very difficult conversation for them to have. Everybody talks about a feeling that either in their parent, depending on the age of the person you're speaking to, it's either their parents or their grandparents' generation. Everybody has this story about their people being beaten for speaking the languages. Wow. So, and they often refer to this this phrase that was uttered by a US soldier who at the end of the 19th century opened a school for Native American children. And he said it was his intention to kill the Indian to save the man, i.e. to utterly eradicate Native American culture and assimilate them into the US system. So that would be no speaking of their languages, mainly all of their beliefs. There's heavy things about trying to spread the Christian religion here as well to what they would consider pagan beliefs. So there's this whole kind of attempt to eradicate this Native American culture. And so it's very sensitive for them. So I was able to speak to these these elderly people who still continue to speak the language. Manny Ironhawk, he welcomed us into his home. We interviewed him, and he's just this really great guy, full of jokes, and he would tell jokes in Lakota. He would also tell us his favorite expression, which is hoka hey, which I think is their version of like, get it done. We need to do this now. And it was great to kind of hear him say, it's like, there's no time, do it now. And so he took us to the graveyard where he showed where his uncle, he had often used to speak to his uncle in Lakota. We went there and we saw the grave of his uncle. So that was just these figures who used to speak the language. We went to the school where they're trying to teach the language. I think it's every day. It's like half an hour. And these two fluent speakers in Lakota were giving classes online. One was doing it to kindergarten students. One was more elderly, to the teenagers. But if you've learned another language, it's intense. It needs to be intense. I mean, that's just the truth. And actually, that was something that Manny Ironhawk said, that in the past, there had been these immersion schools, nothing but Lakota. And if you're serious about this, that's what needs to happen. Because half an hour a day, I don't think is enough, especially on Zoom. We know that Zoom learning is not as good as in a classroom. And especially the oral tradition, it needs to be present. Now, they are creating dictionaries to try to save these words. That in itself, I think, is kind of interesting. You take an oral tradition, you transfer it into a written tradition, you're losing something. An oral tradition is liquid. It's between you and me. It's unique in that instance. Once it becomes black and white, it's different.
Right.
It's not better, it's not worse. I think that's a fundamental mistake. People think the written has to be better. That's not true. It loses something because now it's solid. When it's the oral, it's a beautiful moment in that present moment that will never be repeated. And I think that's something that they're thinking of.
But it's like when you write it down, you have much more likelihood of keeping it alive as well. So it's like this paradox.
Absolutely. And that's what they've been forced to do, because otherwise I got that figure on the 1,000 left from a group called the Lakota Language Consortium, who have created this dictionary, who have created this curriculum to try to keep it. But I find it quite sad, because it is necessary, as you say. If they don't, Lakota might not be here in 20 years time. Right. But I do think there is a sadness in taking a form and forcing it into another form where it doesn't feel natural.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions. What do you think is the most unknown thing about Native American tribes right now, like that the everyday American doesn't know?
God, I don't know. I'm not even sure about how much I know. I mean,
sure. Just from what you've seen in the Cheyenne River Reservation, what do you think? Like, someone in New York City wouldn't really know about what's happening there?
I think a lot of those things that we touched upon, the importance of the elders, especially because that's very different to kind of mainstream American society that is not, and from England as well, we don't have that position for elders. It's seen as, hey, you've done your part, now it's time to take a rest. And it's not that thing of, no, the elder is the wisest. I mean, that I think is not known. And that importance of an oral tradition, I don't think that's widely understood by someone in New York, what that means. What that means, that this is a language that hasn't been written down, that has existed for hundreds of years on the Great Plains and is now threatened. I don't think people probably understand how dire the situation is, just in material terms of poverty, joblessness. I don't think Native Americans receive that much press. And that was something else also that struck me, this idea of the news desert. Now, in the news, we kind of know about this a lot, which, because of the collapse of lots of media, 25 years ago, in Dakota, North Dakota, South Dakota, there would have been a bunch of newspapers, local TV channels. Well, as the concentration occurs in the US, news really is being concentrated in Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles. So you have these huge stretches of the country that just don't have reporters there. I mean, I'm sure there are some, but when I was trying to do some investigation before my trip, trying to read up as much as I could, I was surprised by how few articles I could find on the fourth largest Native American reservation in the United States. You would expect there to be enough, but no, it's not. You have these individual journalists, say for the New York Times, who will have to cover like 6 states. Like they'll be based in, I don't know, Minneapolis, and they'll have to cover Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota. They just, they're just one person. And I think there's a lot of news that is just not being reported because of these so-called news deserts. And I worry about that because just with what I saw with my own eyes, well, multiply that across the whole country. There's entire stories we just don't know about.
So you said something about how you had covered indigenous communities in Latin America. I'm wondering if this is part of a global situation, in that indigenous tribes or communities that have been impacted by COVID-19 around the world are disproportionately affected, and also conversely more able to help do vaccinations and prevention. What are your thoughts on some sort of global aspect of this indigenous response?
I definitely think that there are problems that are being faced on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation are being faced across the world. I think the loss of languages is occurring across the planet. I mean, you can hear there are some wild stories coming out of Brazil of like the last person of a tribe. Just that's it. He's the last man. And the indigenous authorities there keep this roving circle around him that he has no idea about, in order to let this last member of this tribe kind of hunt in the jungles. And he does these traditions, like he digs holes in a hut and so they can trace him, but they think he has no idea that they're just watching him, keeping tabs on him, and he's the last member, that's it. So all of their belief system, all philosophy of life, because a language is not just a collection of words. And I think that's also someone who doesn't speak a second language doesn't understand. They just think, oh, mug, cup. No, a language is an entire philosophy, is an entire way of understanding the world, understanding your connection to the world. If you speak a second language, do you speak a second language?
I do, yeah, I speak Chinese. I'm also learning Spanish.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Bueno, hablemos en español. But you know that when you speak Mandarin.
Yes.
When you speak Mandarin, you're a different person. Yeah. You know this, right?
Yeah.
When I speak Spanish, I'm a different person. Right. And everyone who speaks fluently a different language knows that. And so that was the joy of seeing these Native Americans when they would speak in their Lakota. They became someone different. And one of them, who's only learning it, it's Manny's wife, she said to me, I feel like I'm the person I'm supposed to be when I speak to him in Lakota. She's learning it for the first time, though. She's not fluent. She's trying her best, but she feels it that deeply. And so I do think that across the world, this loss of languages is being felt in different parts of the world. I do think in parts of Latin America, COVID has been devastating. We know that one of the variants, if I'm not wrong, the Brazil variant, well, that starts in Manaus, I believe, which is the major city in the middle of the Amazon jungle. So we know it's spread through a lot of Native American indigenous communities there. So yeah, I do think these problems are being suffered in multiple communities across the planet. I think there's very universal themes were picked up in these 3 stories I did out of that reservation.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Toby. It's been really fascinating to watch your entire series, which you can see online at cgtnamerica.com. And also just to hear what it was like for you to cover it. Do you have plans to go back or do more stories from Native America?
I would like to, yeah. I mean, I've actually got feedback from everyone we interviewed, and everyone's just been delighted with the stories. They loved them, and they've said, please, you've got to come back when we're free of COVID. And I think it is an ongoing story. It is something I would like to keep on, because I do think that's a community that is not only going through hardship, but has really had its voice silenced. You just don't hear about these complaints, and things need to change. And, I think that's what we tried to do in journalism. We tried to see there's a problem, let's amplify this problem. Let's bring attention to it, and hopefully something will change. So yeah, I'll be back out to South Dakota at some point, hopefully.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Toby, for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure.